Marcus had been saving for 6 months, not in the way people usually save, not automatically, not comfortably. He saved by choosing things. He chose to skip lunch 3 days a week, eating the salad he'd made at home instead of the sandwich from the deli. He chose to work Saturday interpretation gigs, picking up overflow from other interpreters at corporate events, standing in hotel conference rooms, translating business jargon for 8 hours while his shoulders ached. He chose to let the car wait another month for new brake pads. He chose not to fix the leak in the kitchen sink. These weren't noble sacrifices. They were just the mathematics of being a single father, constant small decisions that added up to one larger dream. The dream was Disneyland. Sophie was 8 years old, and every kid in her class had been. They wore the pins on their backpacks. They talked about it in that special voice people used when they talked about magic. Alexa had been to Disneyland twice. Jackson's family went every year. Emma had gotten engaged there. Disneyland was where normal childhoods happened, and Marcus wanted Sophie to have a normal childhood, even if everything else about their life was anything but. He'd opened a separate savings account and named it Sophie's Magic. It made him feel better, like the money was separate from the bills and the rent and the endless stream of expenses that came with being the only adult responsible for another human being. Every paycheck, he transferred whatever was left after essentials. Some weeks it was $30, some weeks nothing. After 6 months, the account held $1,047. That was enough. Not extravagant enough, but enough. Gas there and back, $240. Hotel for 2 nights, $400. Food, modest estimates, $250. Park tickets, $650. That left room for a small souvenir, maybe a meal that wasn't bargain priced, a moment where Sophie could feel like they weren't calculating every expenditure. He booked it in February for early April. He wanted the weather to be perfect. He wanted Sophie to experience Disneyland exactly the way she'd imagined it. Blue sky, warm sun, everything shimmering with possibility. He told his boss at the tech company where he worked as a sign language interpreter that he needed those days off. No callbacks, no emergencies, no last-minute client needs. His boss looked slightly annoyed. Marcus was the best interpreter they had, the one people specifically requested, but he approved it. Sophie had no idea. Marcus kept it as a surprise, which meant keeping it as a secret from the most perceptive human in his life. She was 8, but she had the emotional intelligence of someone much older. That came from having only one parent, Marcus thought. Kids without a backup adult learn to read moods carefully. They understood that their parents' stability was their own stability. He told her the night before they left. They were eating dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, a salad, bread from the sale section of the grocery store. It was around 7 o'clock, and the light was starting to fade from the kitchen window. He'd been trying to figure out the best way to say it all day. "I have a surprise for you," he said, and watched her face shift into that expression of careful hope that 8-year-olds got when they'd learned not to expect too much. "What is it?" She was already worried she'd do something to ruin it, he could tell. "We're going to Disneyland tomorrow for 3 days. She stopped mid-bite. The fork hung in the air. And then something broke open in her face. Not just happiness, but the realization that her father had done something impossible. She knew her family's financial situation the way children always know. She knew that money was tight. She knew that there were things they didn't buy, places they didn't go, experiences they didn't have, and somehow he'd made this one thing happen. She cried, not sad crying, but the kind of crying that comes from being seen, from someone deciding that your dreams mattered enough to sacrifice for. She came around the table and hugged him without letting go, and Marcus held her and thought about all the things he'd given up to make that moment possible. The thought didn't bother him. This was what fatherhood was, a series of small erasures of yourself in service of someone else's wholeness. The drive down took 5 hours. Sophie had packed her stuffed rabbit, a white thing with floppy ears that she'd had since she was a baby. She held it against the window as they crossed into Southern California, as if it needed to witness the journey. Marcus had made a playlist of songs she loved. They sang together, off-key and unself-conscious. He couldn't remember the last time Sophie had acted like a kid, uninhibited, unreasonably happy, without the weight of watching her dad for signs of stress. They arrived at the hotel around 2 p.m. It was a modest place, clean and safe, the kind of hotel that catered to families who were saving up for the parks. The room had 2 beds. Sophie immediately jumped on one, while Marcus brought in their 2 small suitcases from the car. He'd packed carefully, 1 change of clothes for each day, comfortable shoes, sunscreen, a small first aid kit. He'd learned to travel with children through careful planning and minimal supplies. "Can we go to the park now?" Sophie asked, bouncing slightly. Marcus checked his watch. 2:30 p.m. The park was open until 10. They could get at least 5 hours in today, experience the evening, see the castle lit up at night. That mattered. The whole experience, not just the daytime version. "Let me shower and change, and we'll go," he said. 20 minutes later, they were on the monorail. Sophie's eyes were wide and unblinking. She was trying to take in everything at once, the other people, the scenery below, the sense that something was about to happen. Marcus watched her more than he watched the park. This was his Disneyland, seeing his daughter experience magic for the first time. They entered through the main gates at 3:15 p.m. It was April, not peak season, but it was still crowded. Crowds were fine. Marcus had prepared for crowds. He'd made a mental map of the park. He'd prioritized rides and attractions. He knew where the bathrooms were, where to find water fountains, where to avoid the worst lines. He had $17 in cash for food emergencies and a credit card that he was trying not to use. Sophie wanted to see the castle first. They walked down Main Street, and she held his hand tightly, her neck craned back to take in the full height of Cinderella's castle. It rose above everything, pure white against the blue sky. It was designed to be impossible to ignore, a monument to the idea that magic was real and that everyone deserved a moment of believing it. "It's real," Sophie whispered. "It is," Marcus said. They spent the next 3 hours moving through the park. They rode the haunted mansion, which Sophie found thrilling rather than scary. They got in line for Space Mountain and waited for 40 minutes, but Marcus made it fun. They played counting games. He told her stories about planets and gravity. When they finally rode it, she screamed the entire time, and he heard her laugh in the darkness between the stars. Around 6:30 p.m., Marcus felt his stomach remind him that they'd only eaten the snacks he'd packed that morning. Sophie was getting hungry too. He could tell by the way her energy was starting to flag. He'd budgeted for 1 meal at the park. He'd researched the cheapest options. They found a place with turkey legs, which Sophie had specifically asked for. He bought one to share, and they sat on a bench eating it slowly, making it last. This was the part that Marcus had learned to do well, make small amounts feel like enough. It came naturally to him, this skill of rationing joy. One turkey leg became an experience because they ate it slowly, because they tasted it, because they talked about how it wasn't like the turkey they had at home on Thanksgiving. He'd learned that abundance was partly a matter of attention. If you paid attention to something, really paid attention, it could feel like more. As the sun set, the park transformed. The lights came on. The atmosphere shifted from daylight adventure into something more dreamlike, more magical. This was the part of Disneyland that Sophie had read about in the library books Marcus had checked out. The nighttime version, the castle all lit up, the whole place glowing like a story. They were standing in front of the castle around 8 p.m. when Marcus noticed something that fractured his attention. There was a woman standing near the entrance to Fantasyland, probably in her 60s, with short grey hair and a blue button-up shirt. She was standing very still, her eyes moving across the crowds in a way that wasn't quite tracking anything. She looked lost, but not in the physical sense. She wasn't looking for a restroom or trying to find her group. She looked lost in a deeper way, like she was present in a place that wasn't designed for her. Marcus recognized it immediately because he'd spent his entire professional life learning to see it. She was deaf. He could tell from the way she held herself slightly separate from the crowd, from the way she seemed to be watching the world rather than experiencing it. She was in the middle of the most magical place on earth, surrounded by music and sound and announcements and the entire soundscape that Disneyland was built on, and none of it was reaching her. There was no interpreter. No one was signing to her. No one was translating the experience. She was just standing there, isolated in the middle of magic. Sophie tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, the castle is about to do something. Look." She was pointing at the lighting rig. There was going to be a projection show, a story told through light and music and movement on the castle itself. Sophie had read about this too. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. Marcus stood at a crossroads. He could take Sophie to the perfect viewing spot. He could make sure she had the best experience of the day. He could be fully present with his daughter, the person he'd saved for, sacrificed for, brought here to experience magic. That would be the reasonable choice. That would be the choice that most people would make. Or he could help the woman. His hands made the decision before his mind caught up. He crouched down to Sophie's level, his eyes on her face. "Hey, Soph, see that woman over there?" He pointed gently, and Sophie's eyes followed. "The one in the blue shirt." Sophie nodded. "She's deaf. You know how we talked about deaf people, how they experience the world differently." Marcus had always been open with Sophie about his work, about the deaf community he was part of through his job. "She's here alone, and I think she doesn't understand what's happening because nobody's signing to her. And I think that's making her pretty sad, even though she's in the most magical place in the world." Sophie looked at the woman, then back at her father. She was 8 years old. She had been waiting for this castle show. She had been counting down to Disneyland for weeks, and in that moment she understood something about the world that some adults never learn, that other people's experiences matter, sometimes more than your own. "Can you help her?" Sophie asked. "I want to," Marcus said, "but it means I won't be right next to you for the castle show. I'll be interpreting for her so she can understand what's happening. I'll still be watching from over there." He pointed to a spot where he could still see the castle, where he could still see Sophie, where he could position himself so the woman could see his hands. "You're going to stay right here, okay? You're going to watch the castle, and I'm going to help her understand what it means." Sophie nodded. She was a brave kid. She was also a kid who understood that her father's values were more important than her own comfort. She'd learned that from watching him interpret for people who couldn't access the world without him. Marcus stood up and walked toward the woman. He moved carefully, deliberately, trying not to startle her. When he was a few feet away, he made eye contact and got her attention with a small wave. Then he began to sign. His hands moved into the familiar shapes, the language that was as natural to him as speaking. "Hi, I'm Marcus. I'm a sign language interpreter. I noticed you're here by yourself. I thought maybe you'd like some help understanding the attractions and the shows. Would that be okay?" The woman's entire face changed. It was like watching someone turn on a light that had been off for a very long time. Her eyes widened, and tears actually formed in her corners. Not sad tears, but tears of recognition. Someone had finally seen her. "Yes," she signed back. "Yes, please, thank you." Her name was Sarah. She was 62 years old. She'd just retired from a non-profit where she'd worked for 42 years, advocating for accessibility and disability rights. She'd decided to take a solo trip to Disneyland because she'd always wanted to go, because she'd heard it was a place where dreams came true, and she'd never had anyone to share it with. She'd come alone because she'd learned long ago that asking for help often meant being treated like you were broken instead of just different. "I'm so happy you're here," Marcus signed. "The castle show is about to start. It's one of the best things in the park. The lights move, there's music, there are projections telling a story. I'm going to interpret everything for you, not just the facts, but the feeling of it. Okay?" Sarah nodded. She positioned herself so she could see both the castle and Marcus's hands, and then the show began. It started with a single spotlight on Cinderella's castle. Then another light joined it, and another, until the whole structure was illuminated. Music began, orchestral, grand, the kind of music that was designed to make people feel small and transported at the same time. Marcus began to sign. He signed the way a poet would speak, not just translating but interpreting the emotional content of what was happening. He signed about light breaking through darkness. He signed about a castle coming alive. He signed about the magic that was happening in front of them, and he did it in a way that made Sarah feel not just like she was understanding the show, but like she was part of it. The projections started, a story unfolding on the castle walls. Characters appeared. Music swelled. The crowd around them gasped and cheered, and Sarah, watching Marcus's hands, gasped too. She was experiencing what everyone else was experiencing. The magic wasn't something that only happened through sound, through having someone make the world accessible to you, through being included in a moment that seemed designed to exclude you. It lasted about 10 minutes. When it ended, when the lights faded and the music stopped and the castle went back to being just a building, Sarah was crying, real tears streaming down her face. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she signed. "You're welcome," Marcus signed back. "There are more shows tonight. Do you want to experience them together?" Sarah nodded immediately. Marcus looked back at Sophie. She was standing exactly where he'd left her, watching the castle, but also watching her father and the woman he was helping. She caught his eye and gave him a small wave, a permission, a blessing, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest. His daughter understood something essential about him that maybe he hadn't even understood about himself. She understood that this was who he was, someone who helped, someone who made invisible people visible, someone who would sacrifice his own experience if it meant someone else could have theirs. What happened over the next 8 hours was less a series of events and more a complete recalibration of Marcus's day. He'd come to Disneyland with a plan, specific rides, specific attractions, a mental itinerary that would maximize Sophie's experience and stay within budget. He abandoned all of it. Instead, he spent the evening interpreting for Sarah. They went to the jungle cruise. Marcus positioned himself on the right side of the boat, where Sarah could see his hands clearly. The skipper made jokes and told stories as they moved through the artificial jungle. Marcus interpreted not just the words, but the tone, the dry humor, the warmth, the way the skipper was performing for the crowd. He made his hands show what the skipper was feeling as he was saying things. Sarah laughed. Real, unself-conscious laughter. They experienced the Pirates of the Caribbean. Marcus stood near the entrance to the ride so Sarah could see his hands illuminated in the ambient light. He interpreted the scene descriptions, the songs, the story as it unfolded. When Captain Jack Sparrow appeared and did something ridiculous, Marcus's hands showed Sarah the humor, the irreverence, the fun of a story where the rules didn't apply and chaos was celebrated. Sophie stayed with them the whole time. She didn't complain. She held Marcus's free hand sometimes, the hand that wasn't signing, and she watched her father work. She watched how he was transforming the world for another person, how he was taking experiences that were designed for sound and translating them into something visual, into something that Sarah could access. They got ice cream around 10 p.m. The park was closing. Most families had left. The crowds had thinned to the dedicated few who stayed until the bitter end. Marcus bought a single ice cream and shared it between the three of them. They sat on a bench facing the castle, which was unlit now, just a silhouette against the dark sky. "Tell me about yourself," Sarah signed to Marcus. "How did you become an interpreter?" Marcus told her. He told her about growing up with a deaf uncle, about learning sign language as a kid before he could read. He told her about going to college specifically to study interpretation, about deciding to make accessibility his profession. He told her about his daughter, about raising Sophie alone, about how Sophie had grown up watching him translate the world for other people, and how that had shaped her into someone with empathy and grace. "What about you?" Marcus signed. "Tell me about yourself." Sarah told him about 42 years working at a non-profit. She told him about advocating for deaf accessibility in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. She told him about the system that made deaf people invisible, about how most businesses treated accessibility like it was a burden instead of a responsibility. She told him about retirement and choosing to do something just for herself, which meant going to Disneyland alone. "You've been advocating for people like me," Marcus signed, "making the world more accessible. That's incredible work." "And you do the same thing," Sarah signed. "Every day, you make the world accessible for deaf people. You're the reason people like me can experience moments like tonight." Marcus had never thought of it that way. He'd always thought of his work as translation, taking one language and making it into another. But Sarah was right. It was more than that. It was accessibility. It was saying to invisible people, your experience matters. Your presence in the world is worth making room for. They parted ways around midnight. Sarah had a hotel nearby. Marcus and Sophie drove back to theirs, Sophie sleeping against the window, Marcus thinking about the day in a way that didn't quite match what he'd expected when he woke up that morning. He'd come to Disneyland to give his daughter magic, but he'd ended up giving magic to a stranger. And in doing that, he'd shown Sophie something true about the world. That sacrifice for another person wasn't a loss, but a revelation of character. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a strange feeling. Not regret. He couldn't feel regret for helping Sarah, but a kind of hollowness, as if he'd used up something he couldn't get back. He'd spent his one saved day, his one perfect day, not experiencing Disneyland with his daughter the way he'd imagined. He'd experienced it through the lens of helping someone else. And Sophie had experienced it through watching her father help someone else. They spent the second day exploring more of the park. They rode Space Mountain 3 times because Sophie loved it. They found a cheap restaurant on the edge of the property and ate a bigger meal than they'd planned. Marcus let Sophie pick out a souvenir, a small figurine of Cinderella that cost more than he'd budgeted for, but he bought it anyway. It felt important to let her have something to show for the trip, something tangible that proved they'd been there. But throughout the day, Marcus found himself looking for Sarah. Not consciously. He'd given her his phone number the night before, and they'd exchanged contact information like people do who've had a significant encounter. But unconsciously, he kept looking at faces in crowds, wondering if he'd run into her again. On their last night, they saw the castle show again. Sophie wanted to experience it knowing what was coming. Marcus stood next to her this time, not interpreting for anyone, just experiencing it with his daughter. But even as he watched the lights dance across the castle, he was thinking about Sarah, watching those same lights transformed into meaning through his hands. The drive home the next day was quieter. Sophie was tired. The excitement had worn into a kind of bittersweet melancholy, the feeling that something magical had ended. Marcus drove and thought about what he'd sacrificed. He'd given up the full, perfect Disneyland experience with his daughter. He'd given up being the center of her magical memory. He'd given up a full day of putting her first, without the complication of other people needing him. But he'd also shown her something true. He'd shown her that invisible people mattered. That sacrifice wasn't weakness, but strength. That character was revealed in moments of choice, and that choosing to help someone else didn't diminish your love for the person you were helping. It expanded it. 3 weeks later, Marcus got an email. The subject line said, "An opportunity." The email was from Sarah. She'd attached her signature and it included impressive credentials. She was the director of a major non-profit organization dedicated to accessibility and disability advocacy. She'd served on dozens of boards. She'd been recognized nationally for her work. In the email, she explained that she'd been thinking about their day at Disneyland ever since. She'd been thinking about how Marcus had spent 8 hours interpreting for her, translating the entire experience of the park into something she could access. She'd been thinking about how he'd done it, not because he was required to, not because he was being paid, not because he expected anything in return. He'd done it because that's who he was. She wrote, "I've spent 42 years working in accessibility, but I don't think I've ever witnessed someone embody accessibility the way you do. You don't just translate language, you translate dignity. You translate the message that invisible people matter. And I want to build a position around that." Sarah was creating a new role at her organization, Director of Accessibility and Interpreter Training. The position would report directly to her. It would involve designing training programs for interpreters, consulting with organizations about how to build genuine accessibility, not just legal compliance, but actual welcoming, and advocating for systemic change in how deaf people were treated in public spaces and workplaces. The salary was more than double what Marcus was currently making. Marcus read the email 5 times, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch, but there wasn't one. Sarah had simply seen something in him and decided to create an opportunity around it. He called her that evening. The conversation happened mostly in his own voice. He spoke, and she listened over the phone while he used an interpreter relay service for her responses. It was the formal version of communication, the professional version, but underneath he could hear her warmth, her certainty. "I don't know what to say," Marcus told her. "This is incredible. But I also want to be honest. I didn't help you at Disneyland because I was hoping for something. I helped you because you deserved to have the experience." "I know," Sarah said through the relay interpreter. "That's exactly why I'm making you this offer, because you helped someone you'd never met, using a day you'd saved for your daughter, asking for nothing in return. That kind of character is rare. That kind of integrity is what accessibility actually requires." "What if I'm not qualified for the role?" Marcus asked. "You are," Sarah said. "Your qualifications aren't just technical, they're moral. You understand what it means to make invisible people visible. You understand that access isn't a luxury or an accommodation, it's a fundamental right. And you understand how to translate complex concepts in ways that people can understand. That's exactly what we need." Marcus accepted the job. He gave 2 weeks' notice at the tech company, where his boss tried to convince him to stay, and his colleagues threw him a small going-away party. He brought Sophie to his first day at Sarah's non-profit, so she could see where her father was going to work. The office was filled with people, many of them deaf, many of them disabled, all of them working on the same mission, making the world more accessible. Sarah introduced him around. "This is Marcus," she said to everyone. "He's going to help us build something important. He understands that accessibility isn't about charity. It's about recognizing that everybody deserves to be part of the world." Over the next 6 months, Marcus built the interpreter training program. He designed curricula that went beyond just technical skills. He taught interpreters to understand themselves as accessibility workers, not just language translators. He taught them to see every interpretation as an opportunity to translate not just words, but dignity, presence, the message that the person they were interpreting for mattered. He consulted with organizations about accessibility. He helped a major restaurant chain redesign their systems so deaf patrons could interact with menus and staff without requiring special accommodation, because the accommodation was built in from the beginning. He worked with a theater to implement open captioning and real-time interpretation in ways that made deaf patrons feel like fully welcomed guests, not people being grudgingly served. Sophie watched her father's career transform. She watched him go from a job where he translated other people's work to a job where he was shaping systems. But what she noticed most was that he was doing the same thing he'd always been doing, making invisible people visible. One day, about a year after he'd started at the non-profit, Marcus was in a meeting with Sarah and several board members. They were discussing the results of the accessibility program. The numbers were impressive. more interpreters trained, more organizations implementing genuine accessibility, more deaf people reporting that they felt welcomed in public spaces instead of tolerated. But Sarah was talking about something else. She was talking about Marcus's impact on the organization's culture. She was talking about how he'd changed the way people thought about accessibility, not as a legal requirement, but as a moral imperative. She was talking about how his work was inspiring other employees to think about their own roles differently. Marcus came into our organization, Sarah said, because he helped a stranger at Disneyland, not because he was trying to advance his career, not because he was hoping for recognition. He helped because that's who he is. And I think that's the standard we should set for ourselves. Not compliance, but character. Not accommodation, but genuine welcome. Marcus embodies that. After the meeting, Marcus thought about that day at Disneyland. He thought about the moment he decided to help Sarah instead of staying with Sophie. He thought about all the ways that decision could have gone. He could have regretted it, resented it, spent the year wishing he'd made a different choice. But standing in Sarah's office, looking at the work he'd done, the people he'd helped, the systems he'd changed, he understood something fundamental. That moment of choice at Disneyland hadn't been a sacrifice. It had been a revelation. It had been the moment when his character showed itself clearly, not through grand gestures or dramatic acts, but through a simple, quiet decision to help someone whose experience mattered to him. Sarah hadn't recognized his potential. She'd recognized his reality. She hadn't needed to change him or develop him or reward him for doing the right thing. She just needed to position him somewhere his character could be fully expressed, fully valued, fully seen. "Thank you," Marcus said to her. "For what?" Sarah asked. "For seeing me," Marcus said. "For understanding that helping you at Disneyland wasn't about hoping for something. It was about being someone. And for creating a space where that person could do the work he's meant to do." Sarah smiled. "You did that for me first," she said. "You made me visible at a place where nobody else could see me. I'm just returning the favor." That evening, Marcus was at home with Sophie. She was 10 now, a young woman watching her father find his place in the world. She'd watched him work multiple jobs, sacrifice constantly, live in the tension between wanting to provide and barely having enough. And now she was watching him do work that mattered, work that was changing systems, work that was making other invisible people visible. "Are you happy?" Sophie asked him. Marcus thought about the question. Was he happy? He thought about the job, the salary that finally gave him some breathing room, the feeling of doing meaningful work. But that wasn't the deepest happiness, he realized. "Yes," he said, "I'm happy because I get to do what I was always meant to do. I get to help people see each other, and I get to do it not because I have to, but because I get to." Sophie nodded, as if she'd understood this all along. Maybe she had. She'd learned from watching her father that the most important work in the world is the work of translation, taking invisible people and making them visible, translating the world so that everyone can be part of it. If you're watching from a place where you've had to advocate to be understood, comment with your city. We're building a community of people who know what it means to translate the world, just to be part of it. Where are you watching from? Have you ever sacrificed something precious, something you'd saved for, something you wanted, to help someone else? Comment below. Marcus gave up his perfect day with his daughter to give another person their magical moment. Tell me about a time you chose someone else's experience over your own. What's the most invisible work you've ever done? The kind of thing you did because it mattered, not because anyone would know. Some of the most important things in the world happen in those quiet moments where you're making the world bigger for someone else. Share your story. Are you a single dad, working in a field that helps others? Maybe you're an interpreter, a caregiver, a counselor, a teacher, someone who spends your days making the world accessible for other people. Comment with your city and your profession. We want to know your stories. Have you ever done good for someone and then discovered that good came back to you in unexpected ways. Marcus helped Sarah, and it completely transformed his life. But that wasn't why he did it. Comment if you've experienced that kind of mysterious return. If you're a single parent in a position of power, a manager, director, business owner, watch for the people around you who are already living their purpose quietly. Those are the people worth positioning. Those are the ones whose character has already been tested. Comment if you've ever recognized that kind of integrity. What does it mean when someone finally sees the invisible work you've been doing all along? When someone recognizes not just your skills, but your character? Comment below. Sometimes it takes one person paying attention to change everything. Know a single dad with a story like this. Someone whose character was finally recognized by the right person. Send us his name and his city. We're building a community of men who understand that real strength is about lifting others up. Share his story. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to know that invisible work matters. Tag a single dad in your life who's spending his days making the world bigger for other people. Let him know he's seen,